Last year, I was in the hot seat of Jubilee's Surrounded series. I was one atheist surrounded by 25 Christians, and I had a wonderful time. Recently, Jordan Peterson took a crack at it. He was one Christian surrounded by 25 atheists. At least he was, until Jubilee changed the title of the video, probably because Jordan Peterson kept refusing to clarify whether or not he calls himself a Christian.
Since you yourself are a Christian, right?
People debate about that, and I generally don't discuss it publicly.
Which, fair enough, nobody should be forced to adopt a label that they're uncomfortable with. But then, why would you agree to this project if you are famously unwilling to call yourself the very thing that the episode is based around? The episode was clearly planned as one Christian surrounded by atheists, and although I understand why Peterson doesn't want to box himself into a worldview, it's a little bit unfair to the people who showed up, obviously preparing quite hard beforehand in order to debate on the world stage against a Christian, only to find out that the person they're debating against doesn't call himself a Christian. The episode was actually quite shocking to watch and has been widely regarded as a bit of a disaster. It certainly contained some awkward moments.
You're really quite something, you are.
Aren't I? But you're really quite nothing, right? You're not a Christian.
Okay, I'm done with him.
As for myself, I've also spent a fair amount of time with Jordan Peterson trying to get to the bottom of what his religious views are.
Did a man have intercourse with Mary and produce Jesus? That's a factual question. It's not a value question.
You must understand what you're being asked here.
So I think I'm quite well placed to offer a commentary on what I think went wrong when Jordan Peterson paid a visit to Jubilee. We're of course not going to watch the whole thing. I'm going to select some moments, beginning with the moment that I first came across listening to this that made me think to myself, okay, fine, I'll make a bloody response.
So in the Bible, it talks a lot about slavery, right?
Yes.
Yes. So in that, it teaches you how to take care of a slave. Rather than saying slavery is wrong, I think
No,
it
it
should
says
say
that in the story of Moses.
It says slavery is incorrect. It says
Well,
it's immoral.
that's why Moses leads his people away from slavery.
So this seems completely confused to me. It is, of course, true that the Hebrew Bible not only mentions or describes slavery, but proactively condones it and does indeed give you instructions on exactly how to own and sell other human beings as private property. But Peterson makes an interesting observation. In the story of Exodus, the Israelites are enslaved in Egypt, and God frees them from slavery, which Peterson interprets as God telling us that slavery is wrong. Otherwise, why would he have liberated the Israelites from slavery? But there's a big problem with this. Of course, God liberated the Israelites from slavery because the Israelites are God's chosen people. God made a covenant with Abraham and promised that his descendants would inherit a land where they would be together and worship God. In Exodus chapter 2, we read that the Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out to God, and God heard their groaning and remembered the covenant he made with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. The Israelites were God's chosen people. That's why he freed them from Egyptian bondage. But once he did free them, he begins immediately telling them how they can own other people as private property, that is, as slaves. Take, for example, Leviticus chapter 25, which comes after the Exodus. We read, "Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves." That is, the nations that are outside of Israel. So not talking about Israelite slaves, but other nations. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. Sounds a lot like slavery to me. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. So why can you buy male and female slaves from the nations around you, make them your property for life, bequeath them to your children as inheritable property, but not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly? The difference is that the Israelites are God's chosen people, so they get a different set of rules. This is a crucial and I think obvious distinction in the Hebrew Bible, which completely undercuts what Peterson is saying here. But as an Israelite, you can actually have a Hebrew slave. You just have to treat them differently to the slaves from the nations around you. Take a look at Exodus 21. That's that same Exodus which recounts the story of God liberating the Israelites from Egypt. When you buy a male Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, but in the 7th he shall go out a free person without debt. So the kind of slavery that we're talking about here for Hebrews is more like a kind of indentured servitude. You only keep them for a set amount of time, after which they get to go free. Unless, of course, it's a girl. If a man sells his daughter into slavery, she doesn't go free like the male slaves do. she's a slave for life. Oh, and I'm reading here from the updated NRSV translation. The NIV translates the Hebrew word ebed as servant here rather than slave. But take a look at Deuteronomy chapter 5, where that same word, ebed, is used. Remember that you were slaves, ebed, in Egypt. So whatever kind of slavery or servitude we're talking about here in Exodus, it's the same word the Bible uses to describe the Israelites under Egyptian bondage. Oh, and for that male servant who gets to go free after 6 years, if the master gives him a wife and he has children, then when he goes free, the wife and the children stay with the master. But if the man decides that he loves his wife and his children and his master and decides to stay with them, what do you think happens? Do you think they all get to go free together? No, you take the male to the doorpost, you pierce his ear like cattle, and he becomes your servant for life. Later in that same chapter, we read, anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result, but they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. Remember, this is from the book of Exodus, the book which Jordan Peterson thinks tells us that slavery is definitely wrong and immoral. Later, in Deuteronomy chapter 20, God is preparing the Israelites to march into the Promised Land, and specifically tells them the difference in how they should treat those outside the Promised Land versus those who currently reside within it. When you march up to attack a city, make its people an offer of peace. That sounds pretty decent. If they accept and open their gates, all the people in it shall be subject to forced labor and shall work for you. Some peace. If they refuse to make peace and they engage you in battle, lay siege to that city. When the Lord your God delivers it into your hand, put to the sword all the men in it. As for the women, the children, the livestock, and everything else in the city, you may take these as plunder for yourselves, and you may use the plunder the Lord your God gives you from your enemies. So the women, the children, and the livestock are taken as plunder. Now it actually says that this is how you treat all of the cities that are at a distance from you and do not belong to the nations nearby. But what about those nations that inhabit the land that God has promised to the Israelites? However, in the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them. And then it lists a bunch of nations which are to be completely destroyed. So these nations get to escape becoming slaves of the Israelites by being killed. I could go on and on about this, but suffice to say, the idea that the Bible tells us slavery is wrong because it narrates God freeing his chosen people from foreign bondage before going on to give precise instructions about how to own other human beings as private property, particularly those who are foreign and therefore not part of God's chosen people, is at best a gross misreading of the text.
It says slavery is incorrect. It says it's immoral.
That's why Moses leads his people away from slavery.
But why does the Bible predicate and tell people exactly how to take care of a slave? Isn't that immoral? Wouldn't you say that culturally we've evolved as a species, as he said earlier about empathy?
Yeah, I would say that the reason we evolved, so to speak, away from slavery was because the West was founded on Judeo-Christian morality and the presumption that every person was made in the image of God. And so slavery itself became immoral, and that was established by Protestant Christians in the UK, who then convinced the UK government for 200 years to go to war on slavery.
And wouldn't you say that this is about the cultural evolution of humans in general, rather than just Christianity?
No, I think it's the flowering of the ideas that were embedded in the biblical texts across long spans of time.
Okay, so this is an interesting debate, especially the long spans of time bit. I mean, if the Bible really were as anti-slavery as Peterson is making it out to be, isn't it a bit strange that it took literally thousands of years for society to realize that, only finally deciding that slavery was a bad idea around about the same time as the Enlightenment? I mean, of course, there is a long and celebrated history of Christian opposition to slavery, but there's also a slightly less celebrated history of Christian justification for slavery. I mean, I like to think of it this way. Imagine you were to go back in time to some kind of plantation in the American South where slaves were working in the field. Suppose you went to the master of the house and you said, this is wrong. Not just the way you're treating them, but just owning them as private property is a fundamentally immoral thing to do. Where is the first place that slave owner could turn, and compellingly so, in order to justify what he's doing? It goes without saying that it would be the Bible, but I'm going to say it anyway just because because some people don't seem to realize this. If the Bible really were anti-slavery, I would probably expect it to say so. But at the very least, I would expect it to not proactively give instructions on exactly how and for how long and in what manner you can own other human beings as private property and bequeath them to your children as inheritable property. It's no wonder that it took thousands of years of the Bible's existence for people to start thinking that slavery might be wrong, because it's not exactly the most obvious conclusion that you can draw. We're sometimes told that the New Testament changes things a bit, but for one thing, the New Testament constantly reaffirms slavery, such as in Ephesians chapter 6, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ." Now, there is also the injunction to masters to treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, it says. So maybe the masters should be good to their slaves at the very least. But what if the master isn't good to the slave? Well, in 1 Peter we read, "Slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh." The author makes a comparison to Christ taking on suffering for the sake of righteousness, and essentially says that slaves should do the same thing. Now, some people like to point to Galatians chapter 3, where Paul says, "There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." This is surely Paul saying that slavery is a bad thing. But they tend to forget Paul also says, "Nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." Is Paul some kind of radical gender abolitionist? No. He's just saying that whether you're male or female is not relevant to your salvation in Christ. He still thinks that males and females exist and should exist on earth. And so if we're going to be consistent here, we have to think he's speaking in the same way about slavery. If we want to interpret this as Paul saying there should be no slave or free, then we have to also interpret him as saying there should be no male or female, which, funnily enough, is an interpretation I find Christians tend to resist. But anyway, even if the Bible is in some way anti-slavery, at the very, very least, it is incredibly unclear about it. And the fact remains that if you showed this text to somebody who'd never heard of it before, you just can't come away from reading this entire library that is the Bible, thinking that it provides a good foundation for saying that slavery is wrong.
I feel like this is just humans editing based on the cultural evolution of morality.
What do you mean by just?
Just?
Yeah, just humans.
Well, humans.
Editing.
Well,
yeah.
Based on culture and history, right? We get better.
Well, they did do it based on culture and history, but
Yes.
culture and history have their foundations too. So.
Well, yeah, but we're talking about slavery. So many people bolstered it based on the
Everyone
Bible. Based on the Bible. They
that's
looked at
much
it and
less
they
true.
justified it in the United States and the Deep South. They justified slavery
Yeah, but
based
the main
on the
thrust,
Bible.
the main thrust of Protestant thought in particular was stringently
Yes,
against slavery,
which-
and it was about the only movement in the history
Yes.
of the human race that
Yes.
had an anti-slavery direction.
Which was driven by humans and their
That's
understanding
one
of
way of
morality.
looking at it. Well, it depends.
It's the same with women's suffrage. I mean, women's in the patriarchy.
What do you mean it was driven by humans? Humans
Humans.
drove slavery too.
Yes, exactly.
Well, so there's no argument there. If slavery and anti-slavery were both driven by humans, what does your claim that they were driven by humans have to do with it?
Well, the point is that neither are driven by the Bible. It's not like slavery exists because of the Bible, but abolitionism doesn't exist because of the Bible either. The point that this chap is making, I think, is that slavery exists because humans invented it, and eventually humans thought that it was wrong, and the Bible kind of had nothing to do with that. Now, I'm not saying that's the correct view, by the way. I think the Bible might have been a really important text in the abolitionist movement, but I think that's what he's trying to say.
There was a
morality
specific-
based on the culture that within the society that they live
Okay,
in.
fine.
So with
I think
women's
that did
suffrage as
happen.
well is a very similar topic in the Bible. There are denominations in Christianity, such as Pentecostal movement, which do bolster women to be pastors, right? Which I think that's a great thing to do. But most like to disregard
Where do you
women.
think the idea that human beings were sufficiently equal to all vote and not be slaves came from?
If Peterson is insinuating that the answer is the Bible, I would love to know how he interprets the texts I just read out.
Where do
Regard
you
women.
think the idea that human beings were sufficiently equal to all vote and not be slaves came from?
Humans.
Yeah, but so did the idea of slavery.
So did the
that's
idea of God.
Fine, but what's
Yes.
your point? Like, you're not making an argument. You're just saying all thoughts come from humans,
Yes.
regardless of the thoughts.
It's not driven by a higher power. It's driven on our experiences
Define
as
higher.
humans, which is what is best for all people.
Is it driven by conscience?
It could be. Which conscience is also something that has evolved over time, and I think that's
What's
something
the
that
evi-
does evolve in morality and empathy.
Okay, I don't understand the point that you're making.
My point is that God influenced slavery. People looked at the Bible and went, this is moral because God says so, just like women's suffrage.
There's lots
and
of
just like homosexuality.
All human societies were slave owning. So
Yes.
you can't blame that on the Bible.
If humanity decided...
Oh, wait, address that first.
What, about
all
slavery?
human societies were slavers. So you can't blame that on the Bible.
Wait, so what? Who's saying that the Bible is to be blamed for the existence of slavery? Nobody says that. Of course, all societies own slaves, so you can't blame the Bible for slavery. But if the Bible is supposed to be God's moral guidance to humans on Earth, then you can blame it for failing to mention that slavery is wrong. I mean, more or less all other societies were also polytheistic, but the Bible had no problem coming down and saying, I know you're all polytheistic, but I think that's wrong and you should change your ways. So when Peterson says all societies own slaves, so you can't blame that on the Bible, it's a straw man. Who thinks that the existence of slavery can be blamed on the Bible? As in, that's like where it came from. Anyway, then the conversation is timed out.
Let's pause there. You've been voted out by the majority.
So, moving on to the next conversation and a broader discussion on Peterson's definitions of morality and God.
If you're saying that morality and purpose cannot come from science, is the opposite of that true, that morality and purpose can only come from God?
That's a way of defining it, yes.
Okay.
That's right, that's good. So I would say that with regard to the first claim, say, atheists don't understand what they're rejecting, because I would say, by definition, God is the unity upon which moral claims are based. That's a definition. Right.
So this is really important, and it might be helpful in understanding Jordan Peterson's religious views. I made a whole video a while back deconstructing what I think Jordan Peterson's views on God are, but I'll try to summarize here. Peterson tends to point out that in order to do anything, you need some kind of value or preference. If I want to pick up this mug and have a sip of coffee, I need to prefer the state of affairs in which I've drunk a sip of coffee than the state of affairs in which I haven't. That preference is a value, and without that value, I just wouldn't pick up the mug and start drinking from it. But with any value, we can keep digging for more fundamental values. Why did you show up to work? Well, because you value not getting fired. Why don't you want to get fired? Well, because you want to make money. Why do you want to make money? To provide for your family. Well, why do you want to provide for your family? Well, because you love your family. Okay, why do you love your family? You can keep pushing this on, and it seems like it will go on forever unless you reach some kind of foundational value. For Jordan Peterson, that foundational value is God. And he doesn't mean that, well, I think that that foundational value is probably God, although, it could be a bunch of things. I think it's God. No, for Jordan Peterson, it's a matter of definition. He just defines that foundational value as God. That's why he says,
by definition, God is the unity upon which moral claims are based. That's a definition. Right.
So this can lead to some confusion because the atheist might ask, well, do you need God for morality? And Peterson says, God is kind of the definition of the basis of morality, so I don't even really understand your question. Unfortunately, I don't think he's always very good at explaining this, which, as I said, can lead to some confusion. And I think a lot of the talking past each other is coming from the fact that they're just talking about two different things when they use the word God. For a lot of Christians, and seemingly for most of the atheists here, God is the traditional tri-omni being, omnipowerful, omnibenevolent, omniscient.
Omniscient, omnipotent, agentic, supernatural being, some sort of God that is all-powerful, all-perfect,
Omnipotent, all-loving God.
Just like maximally great in all like the
I think it's a
great making
definition.
qualities.
Sure.
The all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good, perfect notion of God.
But for Peterson, God is just the basis of the value hierarchy, which is quite a different kind of being.
So you and I agree on a lot. I mean, when it comes to talking about how men should be masculine and things of that nature, you and I are 100% in agreement. We just don't agree on the justification that God is the only thing that provides morality.
It's not a justification, it's a definition.
What's the difference then?
Notice again, Peterson says, look, God is not the justification for morality. He's not making the typical Christian claim that morality is this thing that exists that can only be justified if God exists. He's making just a simple definitional claim, and I have to say, a quite strange one. And look, people are free to define their terms however they like, but this does make the claim that morality has to come from God a trivially true one. It kind of has no content because you've just defined morality with reference to God. Of course morality has to come from God then.
Is there a
And
hierarchical
that is what
structure?
the quantum...
Is there a hierarchical structure? Are some things more important than others?
So you can see here, Peterson is trying to draw out this value hierarchy that we were talking about a moment ago. And just before they get cut off...
Are some things, I think some things lead to more benefits than
Then,
others.
by your own definition, some things are more important than others.
Yes.
Okay. What is...
What is... and then they get cut off. I think Peterson was probably about to ask something like, what is at the top of that value hierarchy, or what is the most important thing in that value hierarchy? He would then probably just stipulate as a definition that that's God. Next, we get this extraordinary clip, which is one of the most viral from the whole episode.
How you doing?
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
I guess since you said morality and purpose cannot be found in science, it would just depend on like what you're referencing. If you're saying a description of your psychological preferences would be considered within science, sure. But I don't think that you have to say that it comes from science in order to be like an atheist. As an agnostic atheist, I don't know if God exists and I don't believe that a God exists. And the only ones that I would really reject would be like the all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good, perfect notion of God that plenty of Christians like prescribe themselves. So I guess
How is that relevant to this claim?
You're basing a position of morality and purpose in some like notion of God that isn't the same type of notion of God that typical Christians would prescribe. Your notion of God is
What typical Christians?
Yeah, typically when I talk to Christians, they say that they believe in all-knowing.
How about Cardinal Newman, who defined God as conscience? He was a major influence on all of Catholic social theory. How about that Christian?
So Peterson is trying to point out that not everybody defines God in this analytically philosophical manner of all-powerful and all-loving and all-knowing. Instead, it could be something like conscience, or it could be something mysterious that we can't comprehend. But it is perfectly legitimate to ask, okay then, Dr. Peterson, what do you mean? Are you talking about this kind of God? But Peterson really wants to know, what do we mean by believe?
Sure. So do you believe in the all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good notion of God?
What do you mean by believe?
Do you think it to be true?
That's the circular definition. What do you mean
How
when
is
you
that
say
circular?
you believe?
How is that circular?
Because you added no content to the answer by substituting the word true and believe.
Okay, pause. I really don't think this is a circular definition, except I suppose insofar as all definitions are kind of circular to some degree. I mean, yeah, every single word in the dictionary ultimately has to be defined with reference to some other word in the dictionary. So there's some ultimate circularity to definitions. Ultimately, a definition is just putting the same thing in different words. And in defining belief, this guy, Parker, I think his name is, has added the concept of thinking. You have to think it, as well as truth. You think it to be true. I think that does add new information to this word belief, even if that definition is incomplete or is a definition that Jordan Peterson disagrees with. To say that it's circular, I think, is pretty strange.
I said you think it to be true.
All right. So if
What's
you
a
believe
belief?
something, you stake your life on it.
What do you mean by that?
You live for it and you die for it. That's what I mean by that.
Okay, so this sounds a bit dramatic, and without context, also extremely strange. And you can see from the facial expression of one of the people reacting that, yeah, this is an odd thing to say. But you know what? And this might surprise you, I kind of actually agree with Jordan Peterson here, and I think I understand the point he's trying to make. I'm not sure, but I'll try to clarify it. Peterson always likes to point out that people often say they believe things, but when it comes to looking at their actions, they don't act in accordance with the things they say that they believe, which means they probably don't really believe those things. For example, if I said to you that I believe totally that it's not going to rain today, but then you saw me pick up an umbrella on my way out of the door, what would you think? You'd probably think that I was either just lying to you, or that maybe I thought I kind of believed it, but in my heart of hearts, I don't really. So what you really believe is not just what you say you believe, or even maybe what you think you believe, but what you act out. What do your actual behaviors point to?
It isn't something that you say. It isn't something that's associated with logical consistency. It's not declarative. It's not propositional. It's not a figment of your imagination. It's the presupposition of your attention and your action.
But why does Peterson say that you stake your life on it?
If
What's
you
a
believe
belief?
something, you stake your life on it.
What do you mean by that?
You live for it and you die for it.
Like as a point of definition almost, why does he think that to believe something, you have to be willing to die for it? That question prompts this extraordinary exchange.
Okay, so you're saying that you don't believe something if you wouldn't die for it?
Not really, no.
Okay. So then,
How would you define belief? Something you say?
Can I explain? Like, I could believe it is the case that this pen exists, but if someone like threatened my life, right, I would lie in order to be able to save my life, right? Like, I think you would do that too. You wouldn't lie to save your
Don't
life?
be so sure.
You wouldn't lie to save your life?
How much do you know about me? I didn't lie to save my career. I didn't lie to save my clinical practice.
Would you lie to like save your children, your mom, your dad?
I don't think lying would save them.
Okay, pause. So the idea is that in order to believe something, like the idea that this chair exists, you have to be willing to die for it. And this guy says, well, yeah, I believe that this chair exists, but if my life depended on it, I would happily just lie about it and say that I don't believe that. But I think one thing people are missing from this exchange is that in order to lie about something, you have to believe it. If somebody threatened my friend with a gun and said, Alex, you have to say that this chair does not exist or I'll shoot your friend, then yeah, I'll probably lie. I'll say, yeah, okay, the chair doesn't exist. But that doesn't mean I don't believe the chair exists. I still believe it exists. I would just be willing to lie about it. So if my life depended on me saying that the chair didn't exist, I would happily say it. But suppose my life depended on me believing that the chair didn't exist. Could I do it? For example, suppose I'm in some kind of aeroplane and I want to sit down on a chair. If that chair exists, then I'll sit down on the chair. But if the chair doesn't actually exist, I'll fall through the ground and I'll end up dying. In that circumstance, regardless of what I say, regardless of whether I'm willing to lie about it, whether or not I actually sit on the chair will have to depend on my actual belief. Does the chair exist or does it not? Like if I'm in that aeroplane and I say, yeah, I believe the chair exists, but I don't actually believe it, I'm not going to sit down on that chair. If I don't believe it's really there and it might kill me to sit down, I'm not going to sit down. So to truly believe something means that if for some reason your life actually depended on that belief, you would act in accordance with that belief. In other words, you'd be staking your life not on saying that you believe it, but on actually believing it. So they talk about the existence of a pen, and this guy says, I believe the pen exists, but if my life depended on it, I would just lie. Okay, but would you stop believing that the pen existed? Even if you lied about it, would you actually stop believing that the pen is there just because somebody was threatening your life? That's not something you could do. Even if your life depended on it, you can't just change your beliefs like that. So the question is not, when your life depends on it, would you lie? The question is, when your life depends on it, which belief do you actually act out? And whichever one you act out in that circumstance is probably the one you really believe. I think that's kind of what Peterson is getting at here. But to be clear, I don't know. I could be way off the mark here in terms of what Peterson actually meant to say. I suppose I'm just trying to steel man Peterson here by putting this statement into what I think is probably its most plausible form. And I've actually thought about this exact thing before. In fact, we kind of had the same discussion when I spoke to him on his podcast.
When people are looking for essentially definitions, and just a second ago you said, well, what is it to believe? And you said, well, what you believe is what you're willing to die for. I'm not willing to die for my belief that this chair exists.
Maybe
in a broad sense. If not believing that the chair existed required me to sort of give up my trust in my sense data, then I might literally die by accident by sort of walking off a cliff because I don't trust my eyes anymore. So it's true in that sense.
So I actually had the exact same initial response as this guy in the Jubilee video. I said, well, I believe that this chair exists, but I'm not willing to die for that belief. And then I immediately realized, wait, hold on. Yeah, I kind of am actually. Like, I'm not willing to always tell the truth about that belief, even if it means my life is at risk. But when it comes to how I actually act, if my life depended on the existence or non-existence of this chair, I just do believe that it exists, and so I would act as if it does exist. So in that sense, what I truly believe is something which, at least in some circumstances, I would be willing to die for. Even if you lie all the time when anybody asks you about your beliefs, to lie about that belief still requires that you actually believe it. But then the conversation shifts onto the concept of lying and the question of whether you would lie to save your life.
I would lie in order to be able to save my life. Right? Like, I think you would do that too. You wouldn't lie to save your life?
Don't be so sure.
You wouldn't lie to save your life?
How much do you know about me? I didn't lie to save my career. I didn't lie to save my clinical practice.
Would you lie to like save your children, your mom, your dad?
I don't think lying would save them.
Can there ever be a circumstance logically that lying could save someone?
Yeah, and if you're steeped in sin, you're likely to live in circumstances like that.
Clearly, this guy is just trying to ask, like, is there some circumstance, Dr. Peterson, in which you would be willing to lie? Like any circumstance. If someone was threatening your friends or your family over something super trivial, would you be willing just to tell that one lie in order to avoid that circumstance? And Peterson just doesn't want to answer that question. Now, I must say, having sat across from Peterson a few times, I can tell when he's starting to get kind of irked, I think. And here, he does look a little bit angry.
Can there ever be a circumstance logically that lying could save someone?
Yeah, and if you're steeped in sin, you're likely to live in circumstances like that.
It seems like he's getting a little bit irritated by this conversation, and it's not entirely clear why. I mean, I don't think this guy's being rude. I don't think he's being unreasonable. I think he's asking important clarifying questions, and Peterson seems quite hostile in response. But anyway, Peterson says here that if you're steeped in sin, you're likely to be in the kind of circumstance where you need to lie in order to save your family. But I thought the point of Christianity was that it offered redemption from sin. Like, yeah, suppose your entire life had been lived steeped in sin, but then you discover Jesus, then you discover the possibility for redemption. So you become a Christian, you ask for forgiveness, you repent of your sins. This guy's just saying, look, Dr. Peterson, if you were in a situation where you had to lie to save your family, what would you do? And Dr. Peterson says, well, I think you'd already have to be pretty steeped in sin to be in that circumstance. Okay, yeah, maybe you are, but then suppose you ask for forgiveness for those sins, which is kind of what Christianity is all about. If you are now in a situation where you had to lie to save your family, would you do it? Again, Peterson just doesn't want to answer this.
I'll give you an example. If you're like in like Nazi Germany, and it's the case that there's like Jewish people in your attic and you're trying to protect them,
example.
would you lie to like the Nazis?
I would have done everything I bloody well could, so I wouldn't be in that situation to begin with. It's a hypothetical, and it's not answerable.
You can't answer hypotheticals?
No, I can't answer a hypothetical like that because
Did
it's
you eat
far.
today?
Look,
Did you
don't
eat today?
play games.
I'm not playing games. I'm just
Yes,
asking if
you
you
are.
ate it.
If you present me with an intractable moral choice that's stripped of context and you back me into a corner, you're playing game. I just told you
Hypothetical.
I would do everything that I could to make sure that I'm never in that situation.
This is really strange to me because this is just a bog-standard philosophical thought experiment. If you are hiding Jews in your attic and the Nazis come to your door, do you lie about it? Peterson's answer, curiously, is just to say, well, I don't think I'd be in that situation because I will have done everything I could to avoid it. But okay, suppose you did everything you could to avoid it and you failed. Somehow. Maybe it's not your fault individually. Maybe you grew up in Nazi Germany and you tried your best to stop the onslaught of fascism, but you just couldn't do it. You weren't powerful enough. Now you're in this situation. Like, what do you do?
By the time you've got there, you've made so many mistakes that there's nothing you can do that isn't a sin.
Okay, but suppose you made those mistakes and then you realize, oh gosh, I've made such a terrible mistake. From now on, I want to be the best person I can be. I want to be as moral going forward as I can be to make up for my past mistakes. Which, by the way, is like Peterson's whole thing. You know, making small moral improvements day by day to better yourself as a person while recognizing that moral perfection is impossible to immediately achieve. And so just making sure that you're doing better today than you were yesterday. I thought that was like his whole message. All we're asking here is how do we apply that philosophy to a situation like this where you are steeped in sin but now want to be a better person? And then Peterson has quite a visceral reaction to answering this hypothetical.
Being born in Nazi Germany and trying to protect people that you care about, like there could be a Jewish friend that you have and you want to protect them.
I think you should
have
just
them
give
in your
up on
attic.
that line of questioning.
Give up on just like trying to clarify your position? Because you
I
don't
did
like, are you like
clarify.
uncomfortable with me asking this question? It's just a basic hypothetical. Like I could ask you.
It's just a basic
Yeah, yeah.
hypothetical
Like,
where
like,
you
if you-
put Jews' lives at stake in Nazi Germany. That's just a basic hypothetical.
Obviously, you
Oh man, that's just so unfair. Like, you know, the way he's just said, oh, really? It's just a basic hypothetical? You put Jews' lives at risk and that's just a basic hypothetical to you? Clearly what this guy means is it's a basic hypothetical in that it's morally basic, in that it should be relatively obvious. Like suppose we were having a debate about whether morality exists or not. And I said, oh, here's a basic hypothetical. Suppose someone were torturing innocent babies for fun. Would that be wrong? That's just like a basic hypothetical in the sense that it should be relatively basic for you to answer. It would be so unfair to turn around and go, oh, that's just a basic example, is it? Torturing babies for fun. That's just a basic hypothetical for you? Like, yeah, it's basic in the sense that it's morally obvious. That's why these kinds of thought experiments are invented in the first place. And despite having that quite emotive reaction to this basic hypothetical, Peterson knows that it's just a basic bog-standard hypothetical. Because listen to what he says earlier when the guy originally brings it up.
I'll give you an example. If you're like in like Nazi Germany and it's the case that there's like Jewish people in your attic and you're trying to protect them, would you?
Yeah, I know the example. That's quite a dismissive way to talk about this issue. I mean, we're talking about Jewish lives being at stake in Nazi Germany, and you're just like, oh yeah, I know that example. Yeah, because the sense in which you dismiss this by saying, oh yeah, I've heard of this argument, is not you dismissing the moral seriousness of the situation, but you dismissing the utility of this thought experiment. In the same way, this guy saying that it's just a basic hypothetical is not him saying that there's no moral seriousness in the situation, but rather that the morality of the situation is quite basic and straightforward.
Obviously, you would lie in that scenario to save their life, but you're like not trying to answer this question for some reason.
I just told you why.
Are you anti-fascist? Like, so you're
Why
anti-fascist?
are you asking that?
I was just asking, just clarifying. But like, okay, again, you're not answering this hypothetical because you know it shows that you clearly would lie to save someone's life.
I'm answering it in
Obviously,
a
that's
manner
not what
you
truth
don't
is.
find acceptable.
Obviously, because I care about truth.
I wouldn't be in that scenario.
So it does seem like there's some kind of cut there, but Peterson just keeps saying, well, I just wouldn't be in that situation. But firstly, I don't think you can know that. Secondly, Christianity is all about people who find themselves in these kinds of situations where they're responsible for things they regret and now want to act morally. And thirdly, what if it's like somebody else? Then the moral question just becomes, what should they do? And you can't answer that by saying, well, they just wouldn't find themselves in that situation. Because some people did. Anyway, that basically concludes this debate about the ethics of lying, although it's not so much a debate when Dr. Peterson is unwilling to offer his opinion on the matter. Like, he doesn't even say it would be wrong to lie, or I think it would be okay to lie. He just says, I wouldn't be in that situation and I refuse to engage with the hypothetical. But even so, this entire discussion is also based on a faulty premise that if you believe something but you're willing to lie about it, that somehow means that you don't believe it anymore? And even that was a tangent from the original question, which was, of course, does Jordan Peterson believe in the all-powerful, all-loving conception of God, which we still haven't even come close to so much as approximating an answer to. Now, the next person Peterson talks to is later chosen by him as his favorite conversation to be revisited later, and I can see why. She's obviously put some effort into understanding his religious views and asks, I think, some really interesting philosophical questions.
My next claim is that everybody worships something, including atheists, even though they might not know it.
Hi.
Good work.
Thank you.
Hi there.
I'm Zena. So I want to start off with defining terms.
Yeah.
How do you define worship?
Prioritize.
Prioritize. So almost like having a preference over something rather than the other.
It's a hierarchy of preferences.
Yeah.
And you use it to direct your attention.
Right.
So whatever you're attending to, you're worshiping.
Right. So I've kind of become a little bit familiar with your idea of like this value-laden hierarchy.
Yeah.
Right. And you kind of posit that at the bottom of this hierarchy, or you could call it top or bottom, I suppose.
Right.
At the bottom of this hierarchy, this foundational priority in your life is going to be considered God.
That's
Is that
right.
correct?
Yes.
Right. I'm trying to imagine a situation in which could there be that someone has a priority at their foundation that is different from someone else's?
Oh, definitely.
Right. So we can have different conceptions of God.
That's why we fight.
Right. So essentially, there's not one God, but there are multiple gods, and these gods exist in some realm of truth.
Okay, so right off the bat, a brilliant question. Remember, for Peterson, God is just defined as whatever is at the base of the value hierarchy, the fundamental value. This woman, Zena, has asked, can't people have different fundamental values? Peterson says, yes, of course. But if God is just defined as that fundamental value, that means that there are lots of different gods. Remember, for Peterson, God is not just the justification for that basic value or something. God is the basic value. Insofar as God exists, he is just that fundamental value. So if there are different fundamental values, it seems like there really exist different gods, at least in the sense of exist that Jordan Peterson would apply to God. But presumably Jordan Peterson is not a polytheist. He believes in one God if he believes in a God at all. And so how can he account for the fact that there are various fundamental values and yet presumably only one actual God?
So essentially, there's not one God, but there are multiple gods, and these gods exist in some realm of truth. It's true that this person has one God and it exists.
Yeah, probably better to think about it as multiple values, but that there's a hierarchy of values with something at the bottom.
Well, hold on. It's not better to just think of that as a value, because that fundamental value is God. I thought we made that a matter of definition.
Right, but the bottom is God, and
That's a definition, yeah.
Yeah, so at the bottom is God, and there can be multiple people with different conceptions of God, and they're each valid in being called God. So there are multiple gods that exist.
Yeah, if God just is that foundation, then we've now got multiple gods, and we need to know how to account for that. Okay, this is where it's about to get really interesting.
It depends on what you mean by valid. So far, so good, but it depends on what you mean by valid, because I would say that some foundational conceptions don't play out when they're implemented. So if you put the wrong thing at the foundation, you end up in hell.
Okay, so there are right and wrong fundamental values. How do we determine what is a right fundamental value and what is a wrong fundamental value?
So you're saying...
So they're not all equal. Like, all foundational principles are not equal, even though they might be equally foundational. Right.
So what makes one kind of foundational tenet like better than another one?
That's an excellent question.
I agree. In fact, I think that's the most important question anyone has asked so far.
Iterability. Imagine that you play a game with someone and you're a kid, and it's fun. So then you play again and again and again.
So repetition.
It's playability across multiple iterations. So then you have a friend, and a friend is better than having a game. So that's one.
Okay, so iterability is one thing that we can use to judge whether a fundamental value is a good fundamental value or a bad fundamental value. But hold on, doesn't that mean we need to value iterability? And we need to use that value of iterability to judge what I thought was supposed to be our fundamental value. If the value is fundamental, that means that it's at the bottom or the top of this value hierarchy. So how can there be a more fundamental value, that is iterability, by which we can then judge that fundamental value? Like, seriously, think about this for a moment. We're dealing with the problem of multiple different fundamental values.
Could there be that someone has a priority at their foundation that is different from someone else's?
Oh, definitely.
A fundamental value is the most basic value that everything else is oriented towards. If it's the most fundamental value, then you can't have other values by which you judge if it's a good or a bad fundamental value.
Breadth of application is another. So if it's just for me now, it's not as good as something that would be benefit to both of us across time.
Okay, so Peterson also values breadth of application, but that's also a value. Like, these are all values, iterability, breadth of application, that we're using to judge whether another value is good or bad. But if we're using, say, breadth of application and iterability, these values, to judge some other value x, then that value x is not fundamental, because we're using something more fundamental to judge whether it's valid or not. That means that those are our most fundamental values. Does that mean that they are God? Like, iterability and breadth of application just are what God is? Well, that's obviously not right. So what's going on here? If Peterson defines God as a fundamental value, the characteristic quality of a fundamental value is that it's fundamental. It's where the buck stops. You can't get there to the fundamental value and say, well, we've got this other set of values which we'll use to judge whether it's good or bad. That means it's not fundamental.
Right. So we're explaining like characteristics that can be applied to like these types of like foundational values. But why is it that this iterability makes it better, and what does better mean?
Exactly. If you've got two people and they've both got fundamental values which conflict with each other, why does iterability make one of them good? And why does not having iterability make the other one bad? It seems like his only two options here are to say that that value is still God, but there is some more fundamental value by which we can judge whether somebody's sort of got the right God or not. And that would mean that God is not the most fundamental value in the hierarchy, which would contradict his definition of God that he gave earlier. Or he can say, okay, then that more fundamental value judgment is what God is. But when asked to list some examples, he gave iterability and breadth of application, which don't sound like great definitions of God. Either way, we've got a very serious problem here, and there might be an answer to it, but I'm not hearing a strong one from Jordan Peterson right now. I mean, take a look at this moment, and remember, we've just established that there are some fundamental values which are valid, and therefore approximate God, and some which are invalid, and therefore they don't approximate God.
So I'm essentially trying to figure out, do you believe that something can be good, like stance independently, something that can be good?
I don't know what you mean by stance independent.
Okay, so
you mean independent of people?
Independent of people. We can use that, or more so, I want to be more specific. Something that can be good, right, regardless of any end goal. It's just good.
No, I think good is tied up with goal.
Goal, okay. I completely agree. So in a sense, this is why...
That's why the religious goal in Christianity is the establishment of the kingdom of heaven on earth. It's goal dependent.
Okay, right.
So it's in reference to a goal.
So,
or the goal would be the imitation of Christ.
Someone's goal, right, can be something that doesn't encompass being in congruence with God or being with God.
Yeah, so someone's ultimate goal could be invalid and therefore not congruous with God, right?
No, the thing that they want to be in congruence...
Oh, right, okay.
That's right.
Sorry,
That's
I
right. That's
corrected
good. That's
myself.
great. The thing they want to be in congruence with is fundamentally equivalent to their God.
So we're now back to the idea that somebody's ultimate goal just is God. I mean, he did say their God, which could imply that different people have different gods.
Is fundamentally equivalent to their God.
But again, he's just stuck with this dilemma that he has to say either they're all equally legitimate gods, in which case there are just lots of gods that exist, or he has to say, well, their God is the wrong God. And we're back to the problem of having to judge what is supposed to be our most fundamental value, God, with reference to other, more fundamental values.
My final claim is that atheists accept Christian morality, but deny the religion's foundational stories. Hi there.
It's very nice to meet you.
What's
I'm
your
Ian.
name?
I'm Ian.
Hi, Ian.
Yes. So God says that you can own people as property. He says that you can beat them with a rod too. He commands genocide in Deuteronomy, in Numbers, and in Samuel. I mean, they have a goddamn baby barbecue in Numbers. Like, is all of this in line with Christian ethics?
Okay, we're back to slavery, and this time with genocide as well. My favorite subject in the context of the Hebrew Bible is what I mean by that.
Is all of this in line with Christian ethics?
No.
So then God doesn't fit within Christian ethics.
This is, I think, a simple but valid point, and despite all of the debates I've had about this, I haven't had a satisfactory answer. God commands the slaughter of innocent children. Children we know are innocent, non-combatants, non-combatant women as well, not to mention animals for some reason too. And the question is, why would God command such acts of seeming genocide? This was actually one of my prompts when I was doing the surrounded thing for Jubilee. I said that God commands genocide in the Old Testament. And Christian responses to this vary because, the text is there, it's quite clear. But some Christians say it's an exaggeration. They say that God didn't really want the Israelites to wipe everyone out. He was just using exaggerated war rhetoric. Others might just be more liberal about scripture. They say these things just didn't happen or were misreported. But some just say, yeah, God commanded the slaughter of children and he had every right to because, he's God, so why not? That's the line that, for instance, William Lane Craig took when I interviewed him about this problem. And look, if you want to see somebody just own an unfathomably unintuitive moral conclusion, grab some popcorn and stick that episode on.
It was actually a tremendous blessing to these children for them to be killed and go to heaven and be with God.
You must understand how that sounds. But let's see what response Dr. Peterson chooses.
Well, the biblical library is a continuing story, and everything written in it has to be contextualized by the entire text. There's 65,000 hyperlinks in the biblical text. And you can take pieces of it out of context and criticize them, and that's what you're doing. But that's a mistake, I think. It's an analytic mistake because you're putting the cart before the horse.
Okay, so I do agree that it's really important to contextualize, particularly biblical stories. But before we do that, I always like to ask somebody, okay, what is the kind of context you think could exist that would justify God commanding the slaughter of innocent children and non-combatant women and non-combatant men like the disabled, as well as the animals that also live in that area? Like, what kind of context do you think could justify that? We're told that these Canaanite tribes are deeply immoral and have been in their sin for hundreds of years, but we also know that the children are slaughtered. Unless you just want to say that, well, the children deserved it too, which maybe you think. A lot of Christians think that people are just born in sin. But why do the Canaanites deserve that more than any other tribe? Like when you're talking about that individual child, they've committed no more or less sin than an Israelite child of the same age, if we're talking about like infants. And yet when the Israelites are sinful, God sends them a messenger with literal stone tablets guiding them to the truth and giving them a promised land. When the Canaanites sin, they don't get that same moral guidance. They get the Israelites coming in and slaughtering the men, women, children, and animals. It just doesn't seem that fair intuitively. So again, I understand that we need to contextualize these stories, but what kind of context do you think provides a moral justification for commanding the slaughter of non-combatant children?
I really don't think so. I think that if we say that something is Christian ethics, then I think that all of the books essential to Christianity would fit with it, especially if it's like the main character. When we're talking about
How do you deal with
God,
the morality of war?
So
how do you think you should deal with the morality of war?
The morality of war is a complicated and deep issue, ethically speaking, but I think most people are agreed that you shouldn't, command the slaughter of children. And we're not talking about children dying as accidental collateral victims of a greater war. We're not even talking about a nation intentionally killing children, but at least saying that it was an accident. We're talking about God proactively commanding the slaughter of these children, like on purpose. I don't know, Dr. Peterson, I kind of want you to tell us what kind of just war theory could incorporate such a command. Now, before we move on, I just want you to sit and think to yourself for a moment. Do you think this guy's being rude? Like the guy who's just sat down to talk to Jordan Peterson. I mean, they're trying to get their point across and they're trying to do it quickly. I've been in that situation. I know how difficult that is. But do you think he's being rude? Do you think he's being purposefully obtuse or playing games? Doesn't seem that way to me, but look how this conversation unfolds.
Because I feel like the morality, I feel like Christian ethics, this is kind of, I guess I just think it's kind of an absurdity to say that God doesn't fit within Christian ethics, but sure, well, we can go on my ethics, that's totally fine.
I don't know what you mean by an absurdity. What game are you playing with that?
So Peterson wants to know what game this guy's playing with that question. And, this guy might not be formulating his thoughts as clearly as he could. It's a difficult and quite brave thing to do on a platform like this. But it doesn't seem to me like he's playing games.
I don't know what you mean by an absurdity. What game are you playing with that
Well, I just think that it's an absurdity to say that the Christian God doesn't fit within Christian ethics, that the Christian God isn't Christian ethical.
I said that the specific statements that you made don't take the context of the stories into account, and so that your analytical approach is faulty.
Sure.
Don't put words in my mouth.
Sure, then let's go through the
Okay, I can understand why it might be frustrating when it feels like somebody isn't understanding you or isn't listening to you properly, but I don't think this guy is doing anything that warrants that kind of anger from Jordan Peterson. And Peterson is upset that he's putting words in his mouth because he said, well, I think it's an absurdity to say that God doesn't fit within Christian ethics. And Peterson says, well, I never said that. Of course, you never said that. The point is he's trying to argue that that's the implication of your worldview. It's a bit like if Jordan Peterson says, well, you're an atheist, but you do worship something. And I said, hey, don't put words in my mouth. I never said that. That would be a totally inappropriate response. Yeah, of course I didn't say those words, but it's still your view that that's what I'm doing. The point is not that I'm trying to express your views in your own words, but I'm trying to tell you what I think are some implications of what you're saying. I mean, yeah, if somebody is intentionally ascribing views to you that you just don't hold, that's one thing. That might be putting words in your mouth, but it just doesn't seem like that's what this guy's doing here.
Don't put words in my mouth.
Sure, then let's go through the example. Yeah, so, and I apologize. So let's go through the example. So in 1 Samuel 15:3, God says, go and slaughter the Amalekites, slaughter the men, the women, the children, the infants.
Hey, don't forget about the animals. He also says to slaughter the cattle, the sheep, the camels, and the donkeys.
What's the justification for that? Is that in line with Christian ethics?
That's a good question. I don't really know what to do with the terrible, blood-soaked, saturated history of the human past. I don't know. And I don't think anybody knows.
Yeah, but this isn't just a record of history, is it? It's not just the Bible saying, here's something that happened. This is a report of a command that God gave through one of his chosen prophets to one of his chosen kings over his chosen people, which isn't quite the same thing.
What you try to do in your own life, as far as I can tell, is to conduct yourself in a manner that makes such things much more unlikely.
I totally agree.
We're all saddled with the problem of the catastrophes that got us here, aren't we?
Yeah, but this one was commanded by God. That's the problem.
Yeah,
That's what differentiates it from anything else, is that this one, it's God saying, go and do this atrocity.
Do you think that there's ever such a thing as a righteous war?
Again, I think Peterson is evading the important question. The question is not about the ethics of war more broadly, but specifically about this command to slaughter children. And of course, animals. Yeah, I get the point here. There are some wars that are just and some that are unjust, and exactly how we work out which is quite murky. But I think we can all be in rough agreement here that the intentional slaughter of children is not just. And if that's the case, how can we account for God commanding this specifically in 1 Samuel chapter 15?
God saying, go and do this atrocity.
Do you think that there's ever such a thing as a righteous war?
I'm skeptical. I'm not sure. It would probably be situational.
Well, right, fair enough.
Yeah, but this one certainly wasn't a just war. The context for the Amalekite slaughter is that 400 years earlier, they fought one battle, which they lost, and God says, that's it, I'm going to wipe them off the face of the goddamn earth. And then 400 years later, he commands the Israelites to genocide their great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren. That's not a just war at all. And also, a genocide is not a war.
Well, a genocide can be a war, but...
Absolutely not. The genociding of the Amalekites, the men, the women, and the infants, that's not a war. The infants aren't combatants.
Look, I already said that it's very difficult to look at the blood-soaked past and to know exactly what to do about it. The answer I gave to the gentleman who is sitting here before you is that it's necessary to read a text like the Bible at all of its levels of analysis simultaneously. And there's a directional morality that emerges across time that has its roots in the Old Testament, for example, with its restrictions against murder specifically, that makes itself manifest in the Christian texts as the insistence on voluntary self-sacrifice as the foundational belief. That's a profoundly anti-violence ethos.
Okay, but the problem is, even if there is some kind of moral trajectory to the Bible for some reason, the idea that an all-loving God would proactively command something which is evil just seems conceptually incoherent. And so we have to tackle this problem head on. And of course, I completely understand why somebody would just say, I don't know, it's an incredibly complicated issue. But I do think it's quite telling that when faced with a command to slaughter innocent children and non-combatant men and women, and animals, somebody has to say, yeah, I'm not really sure about that. I'm not sure if it was right or wrong, or if it was wrong, how it was wrong, and maybe there was some kind of justification. I mean, maybe there was, but you can understand why that would be pretty uncompelling to the atheists in the room.
Do you have the belief in your theology?
Well, what do you think of that? Wait a sec. Now, address what I just said.
So I'm about to address it, but I'm addressing it with a question. Do you think that God is by his very essence perfect?
You'll have to provide more.
Sure, just like maximally great and all like the great making qualities.
Sure.
Yeah, like flawless. Yeah. So,
okay,
so does a flawless thing change? Does a flawless thing reveal like more and better information over time? Or would a flawless thing say, here's what's good, here's the absolute good thing to do at all circumstances in time?
Well, we know some of that.
Wait,
Tell
so
the truth. That's one.
That's totally fine, but presumably...
No. You don't get to skate over that, which that's totally fine.
It's a straw man of my position. It's a straw man of the argument. So
the
argument is that God...
Wait a sec. You said find one maxim that's transcendent across situations.
I didn't say any of those words. I'm not sure what conversation you're a part of.
He's right, actually. He didn't say those words. So who's putting words in whose mouth now? He didn't say, name one thing which is transcendently true. He said that of all God's moral commands, wouldn't we expect, if he's a perfect, unchanging being, for them all to apply across time equally?
Would a flawless thing say, here's what's good, here's the absolute good thing to do at all circumstances in time?
This is what Peterson tells us, he said.
No, wait a sec. You said find one maxim that's transcendent across situations.
I didn't say any of those.
And he points out rightfully that that's just not what he said. And I can imagine this would be quite frustrating, which is probably why he then said, I don't know what conversation you're a part of. But then Peterson just isn't having any of it.
I didn't say any of those words. I'm not sure what conversation you're a part of.
Don't be a smartass.
I'm sorry.
Seriously. I mean it. If we're going to have a serious conversation, conduct yourself properly. Okay. Rephrase your question so that, because I must have missed it. I tried to answer it.
Like, I understand if somebody has really poor discursive etiquette, if they're being really rude, it can be good to give them a bit of a dressing down. But look, okay, I don't think this is the most generous and charitable conversation that I've ever seen, but I don't think this guy is like being really rude. And to the extent that he is, I can see why he's getting frustrated.
Rephrase your question so that, because I must have missed it. I tried to answer it.
So in my mind, I guess by my lights, a perfect being doesn't change. A perfect being, if they're maximally good, maximally moral.
Does our understanding of the perfect being change?
Our understanding might, but presumably what the perfect being is revealing.
Well, I agree. How do we distinguish between that, though, at the human level?
How do we distinguish between whether...
Between our transforming understanding of perfection and perfection itself.
Between our...
We can only see through our own lenses.
Presumably a perfect being would be revealing all of these aspects all the time, especially if God's outside of time. I don't know how a God who's outside of time is revealing different things at different times. That just seems like incoherent to me.
Imagine something that's perfect.
Sure.
And complete.
Sure.
Okay, and it's trying to communicate with creatures who are anything but that.
Sure.
Well, they're going to get it wrong.
Sure.
Okay, now wait a sec. Do you blame that on the interpreters or the phenomena itself?
Wait, but who's getting it wrong here? Peterson responds that our understanding of that perfect being might change throughout time. But what about the people who wrote it down in the first instance? Was their understanding correct or not? Because they recorded this command of God, which was to slaughter innocent children. Were they somehow misinterpreting God? If they were, then the text they wrote down, which is now part of the scriptural canon, is unreliable. Or maybe Peterson is talking about us today misinterpreting the Bible. The argument would have then changed from what it was before. Okay, this happened, but there was important historical context, to, well, we don't really know what happened there because we're probably misinterpreting it today. Or maybe we are misinterpreting it, but then how do you think we should interpret it? Again, Dr. Peterson, we have a text here in which God commands the slaughter of innocent children. Maybe we're somehow misinterpreting it, but if so, I really want you to tell us how you think we should be interpreting this text. I mean, I think the real problem here is that Peterson is just not telling us what he believes. And, I mean, he's under no obligation to tell anyone what he believes. At one point, he even reprimands someone for expecting him to tell them what he believes.
Either you're a Christian or you're not. Which one is it?
I could be either of them, but I don't have to tell you.
You don't have to tell me. I was under the impression I was invited to talk to a Christian. Am I not talking to a Christian?
No, you were invited to.
I think everyone should look at the title of the YouTube channel. You're probably in the wrong YouTube video.
But then again, the question becomes, like, what are you doing here? You know, if you want to have a long-form conversation which gets into the intricacies of the nature of belief and morality, this really just kind of isn't the format for you. And forget just the format. If the specific discussion is supposed to be one Christian surrounded by like 25 atheists, and you won't call yourself a Christian, what are you doing here? Anyway, look, I obviously haven't covered everything here. The video is like an hour and a half long, so I've tried my best to give something of an overview, I guess. Some of it might make sense to you, some of it might not, and you might also think that I've missed some really important moments. Chances are, if I have, it's because I just think I've got nothing interesting to say about them, at least not anything that someone else hasn't already said. But hopefully you can see that while I do generally agree with the consensus that this was a bit of a disaster, I do think Peterson brings some interesting points to the table, and there were moments where I think he was just being misunderstood. Having said that, I do think he could have done a better job of clarifying those misunderstandings, and certainly he could have done a better job of clarifying his positions on, you know, anything. And I can also see why at the end of the episode, given the opportunity to choose somebody to have another conversation with, he chose Xena, because not only did she have the most productive conversation with him and the one that seemed the least hostile, she also seemed to understand his religious worldview the best and offer what I think is the best objection to it. And I guess that part of the reason why I wanted to make this response is that because of the quick-fire format of this Jubilee Surrounded series, you could have missed that this was quite an important interaction right there in the middle of the episode. But okay, that's that.